Chantito-san, I give you the floor. Let's start our session.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning from Bangkok, Thailand. On behalf of the Thailand Institute of Justice, TIJ, and the United Nations Asia and Far East Institute for the Prevention of Crime and Treatment of Offender, or the UNIFE, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the ancillary meetings of the 14th UN Crime Congress on rehabilitations and social reintegrations of women's prisoner and offender. My name is Chontit Chunura, and I am the Director of the Office for the Bangkok Rules and Treatment of Offender at the Thailand Institute of Justice. Will serve as your moderator today. So for those of you who might not familiar with our organization, TIJ is one of the UN Program Network Institutes on crime prevention and criminal justice located in Bangkok, Thailand. So we work on several issues, including promoting the implementations of UN standard and norms on the treatment of prisoner and offender. So the topic of our ancillary meeting today is very timely, as we know that December 2020 marked the 10th anniversary of the UN Bangkok Rules, which is the first international standard that specifically addressed the needs of women's prisoner and women's offender and promote gender-responsive criminal justice system. And also today is the International Women's Day, so we hope that this ancillary meeting will contribute to a wider discussion on achieving an equal and inclusive society for women around the world. So before we begin our discussion today, I have a brief housekeeping announcement. So our session today is 90 minutes, and we have 5 excellent speakers, of which 2 will have a pre-recorded video. So each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and after the final speaker, there will be time for Q&A. So I would like to inform you to use the Q&A tab on the top right corner of your screen, and you can also find speakers' full bios there too. And a recording of this meeting will also be made available on the TIJ website. For me, as a TIJ staff, I find this event is very particularly important, as it also serves as a launch event of the 2 newly published reports that TIJ has the opportunity to support. One report is on the women's pathway in Thailand, and another one is on the cause of recidivism. So without further ado, I would like to announce our first panelist, Dr. Samantha Jeffrey. Dr. Samantha Jeffrey is a senior lecturer at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the Griffith University in Australia. She has a teaching experience of 20 years with a broad research focusing on social justice, especially on marginalized status, offendings, victimizations, particularly her research focused on domestic violence, family law, restorative justice, ethnicities, and women's imprisonments and human rights. So as the lead researcher of the new publications between Griffith University and Thailand, Dr. Jeffrey will be discussing the key finding of the report called Women's Pathway into, Through, and Out of Prison, Understanding the Needs, Challenges, and Success of Women Imprisoned for Drug Offending and Returning to Community in Thailand. The floor is yours, Dr. Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, Chontit, and welcome everyone. I would like to thank TIJ and UNIFE for organising our session today. So in this presentation, I'm going to overview the rehabilitation and social reintegration needs and challenges of women returning to communities post-imprisonment. Please change the slide. So gender structures a social world, and as such, impacts offending, imprisonment, rehabilitation, and reintegration. Female prisoners and those returning home constitute special populations. These women share similar needs to their male counterparts, but many of their experiences are unique and differ in significant ways, creating barriers to reintegration. Facilitating the successful re-entry of women requires knowledge of their pathways into prison, their experiences of incarceration, and an understanding of what they need and what challenges they face post-release. Change slide, please. Research shows that women's pathways into prison are bound to a grouping of interrelated and interconnected factors that limit and shape women's behaviours and women's life choices. These include victimisation and trauma, disordered family lives and other adverse experiences, mental ill health and substance abuse, male influence and control, low levels of education, associated poverty, and familial caretaking. Although men's pathways are characterised by many of these same factors, women experience these aspects differently and perhaps more acutely than men. Change slide, please. Given what is known about women's pathways into prison, and to best support women's reintegration, we firstly need to have gender-responsive and trauma-informed care, practice, and programs in our prison systems that empower and support women's healing and in turn rehabilitation and reintegration. This ought to include the provision of a healthy rather than harming prison environment alongside programs and support mechanisms to improve women's well-being. Women need support, programs and treatment to help them with their substance misuse, victimisation, mental health and trauma. Women need to be extended training and educational opportunities that increase their chances of getting meaningful, adequately paying post-release employment. Further, because of the centrality of familial caregiving to women's lives, particularly women's relationships to their children, we need a prison system that supports healthy familial connection. It is also important that we plan for re-entry from the beginning of a woman's sentence. Prisoners must have re-entry programs that help prepare women for reintegration and connect them with post-release support services. This is known as through care. Because women's lives post-release are distinct from men's, re-entry, like pathways into prison, is gendered. Gender differences in pathways to imprisonment are inherent in reintegration. Formerly incarcerated women have multifaceted and intersectional needs similar to, yet distinct from men. Change slide, please. I'm now going to discuss what we know in terms of women's reintegration needs and challenges. I will be utilising quotes to illustrate my points. You have already seen some of these on previous slides. These quotes come from a recently completed Griffith University and TIJ study. More information about this research and subsequent report will be provided at the end of my presentation. On this slide, I have listed what we know about women's reintegration needs and challenges. I'm going to talk you through each point. Change slide, please. For many formerly incarcerated women, the ability to acquire housing is out of reach due to economic marginalisation, individual level disadvantages, stigma, and gender discrimination in the housing market. Yet having a place to call home is important for successful reintegration. It enables women to regain independence, privacy, and exert autonomy over their lives. Permanent and stable accommodation is viewed as the cornerstone of successful reintegration. In contrast, there is a strong association between poor accommodation and negative outcomes. Women who have unstable or unsuitable accommodation are more likely to return to prison. Homelessness, in particular, creates an environment conducive to substance misuse and offending. Women who cannot secure stable housing may also be forced to return to unhealthy and unsafe housing environments. Change slide, please. Healthy interpersonal connections are strong predictors of successful reintegration. Relationships with romantic partners, family and friends provide formerly incarcerated women with important sources of practical support as well as emotional support, while also offering a sense of belonging, purpose, and incentive to change. However, these relationships can also impede reintegration. It is often the case that intimate partners, friends, and family members are, for example, criminal themselves, and this may lead women back down a pathway to substance abuse and crime. Research exploring a woman's pathways into prison consistently shows that victimization and associated trauma, particularly through intimate relationships, can contribute to women coming into prison. Unsurprisingly, therefore, abusive and criminal intimate partners may also create problems for women during reintegration. They can, for example, make home an unsafe place. This can result in women abusing substances as a coping mechanism. Intimate partners may also use, coerce, or manipulate women into offending. Even if intimate partners are not overtly abusive, intimate relationships with dysfunctional men can be a source of much anxiety for women, and they can also find themselves embroiled in their intimate partner's criminal activities. Disconnecting from these activities could mean breaking up the family. This is something many women are not economically or personally willing to do. Studies of women's re-entry show that children can be an important catalyst for change. Women will often be anxious to reunite with their children when they leave prison. While motherhood can be a strong motivator for reintegration success, it can pose challenges. Circumstances that set women on a pathway to prison to begin with frequently remain unchanged or are made worse post-incarceration. Post-release, women attempting to reunite and parent their children will still need to grapple with issues such as poverty, intimate partner violence, and addiction. So while some women may express positivity about reuniting and parenting their children, others may experience anxiety over their ability to provide for them financially and emotionally. Change slide, please. Poverty frequently underpins women's pathways into prison, and this is made worse by serving time. Post-release studies show that men have better opportunities for securing a sufficient income-producing and legal job by virtue of their gender alone. Women can experience negative reactions from potential employers because of their criminal histories. This results in them taking meaningless, low-paid, dead-end jobs with no chance of advancement. Securing stable employment and earning enough money to support themselves and their families is crucial to women's successful reintegration. The inability to secure adequately paying employment may force women to return to unsafe or unhealthy living environments and push them to earn a living illegally. Change slide, please. Women in prison often have co-occurring needs related to experiences of traumatic victimization, substance abuse, mental and physical ill health. Prison environments can both ameliorate and exacerbate these problems. Re-entry itself is often traumatic and overwhelming. Women may feel unprepared to leave the stable and predictable structure of the prison. Going from possessing little or no agency to doing everything for themselves can be engulfing and trauma-inducing. It is unsurprising that the physical and mental health of women post-release is typically poorer than for women in the general community. Change slide, please. Being accepted back into society is an important factor in re-entry success. However, formerly incarcerated women often experience ongoing stigmatisation. The ex-inmate stigma is more acute for women because they are perceived as doubly deviant. They have violated cultural norms around appropriate feminine behaviour and the criminal law. The impact of the ex-inmate stigma on women manifests in several ways. Compared to those without a criminal record, employers are significantly less likely to hire ex-female inmates, and securing housing is particularly difficult. Further, as women become aware of their outsider status, they may isolate themselves, experience psychological stress, and other health problems. Change slides, please. Reconnecting to society post-release can therefore be difficult. The pains of re-entry can be soothed by connecting women with healthcare, social support services, and programming that is relevant to their needs. However, research shows that pre-release planning is rarely done in prison, and as a result, formerly incarcerated women find it difficult to access much-needed community support services. It is therefore important that through care support be provided through pre-entry planning and post-release. In many correctional systems, women may be released on parole. In theory, the parole system provides a ready-made avenue for service provision and support. Originally, the aims of parole were rehabilitation and reintegration. However, more recently, we've seen a shift. Systems of parole are now framed around surveillance and risk management. The result of this is that being on parole can actually hinder rather than support women's reintegration. Change slide, please. Religion has long played a significant role in prison programs and treatment. Religious practices can provide comfort and guidance in prison and post-release. Faith and prayer have been highlighted as one of the strategies many women use to support reintegration. However, the stigma of the ex-inmate label may result in rejection from religious communities. Please change the slide. Some people maintain that reintegration can only be successful if women are motivated and determined to change. But motivation to change and determination to stay the course is often restricted by social circumstances beyond women's control. Many women leave prison with high hopes and expectations, but are left disappointed once they encounter the real-life difficulties of re-entry. Change slide, please. It is also important to note that common viewpoints of prison reintegration have tended to see recidivism as the primary, if not the only, indicator of reintegration success. However, women tell us that success for them is multifaceted. It includes, for example, re-establishing a sense of well-being, reconnecting, contributing to family, increased self-esteem, recovering from mental illness or substance abuse, securing stable housing, supporting others, being emotionally strong and persevering, establishing healthy intimate relationships, and feeling safe. Change slide, please. To end my presentation today, I want to emphasise that most formerly imprisoned women do not want to reoffend. However, their choices on the outside are often constrained by circumstances beyond their control. Further, it is foolish to position reoffending as the only indicator of reintegration success. Despite the odds, many women are able to achieve other successes in their lives when they leave prison. These successes need to be recognised and celebrated. And final slide, please. This is the QR code for the report, looking at women's pathways into, through and out of prison in Thailand. So this is a piece of research that I recently completed with the Thailand Institute of Justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jeffrey, for the very informative presentations. And as Dr. Jeffrey mentioned, that this research is collaboration between the Griffith University and TIJ, and the research team has managed to conduct an in-depth interview with 75 women in 3 prisons in the country. And as Dr. Jeffrey mentioned, that challenges and success in women transition back into community is multi-dimensional. So that would require holistic and gender-responsive framework in designing the way that we could support these groups of women. So for our next speaker, I would like to introduce Mr. Theodor Leckett. Ted Leckett was trained as a police officer and a prosecutor in the United States. Before spending 9 years as a crime researcher in South Africa, Ted joined UNODC in 2004, where he has led a series of regional crime threat assessment that explore the relationship between crime, conflict, corruptions, and developments. He was also responsible for the creations of the UNODC World Wildlife Crime Report. So Ted is the lead researcher of TIJ UNODC pilot study on the causes of recidivism in Thailand. And the floor is yours, Ted.
Thank you, Chontet. Could I have my presentation? There it is. Thank you very much. Look, first I want to start by thanking TIJ, not just for their support, not just their financial support, but also Chontit herself actually led the focus group. So they were great partners. If you ever get a chance to work with TIJ, I highly recommend you take it because it was a great experience. Next slide, please. But this is just one of a series of studies we're conducting on the causes of recidivism in countries around the world. And the idea here is very simple. We thought if you want to know why prisoners go back to prison, ask them. So that's what we did. We're going into prisons around the world and asking prisoners why they're back here again when they got out and had a chance at not returning. So far, we've just done the 3 countries, Thailand, Albania, and the Czech Republic. Although we're going to do Ukraine shortly, and then hopefully after that, Brazil and Nigeria. So we're increasing our number of countries, and we're going to try to come up with a typology of reasons for recidivism. So we can start to come up with some ideas about what the main drivers are globally. For what we've done so far, we've only spent a week in prisons. We're going to increase this to 2 in upcoming studies where we conduct intensive focus groups. So far, we've done 9 prisons, 31 focus groups, and 216 prisoners participating. And what was really interesting about this work is that we found within a country, the responses in the focus groups were very consistent. So the answers were similar between focus groups, but between countries, the answers were completely different. Next slide, please. So in Albania, the story we got was that prison was for the poor. There, the discourse the prisoners engaged in was all around the fact that the system itself was corrupt. So they saw that they committed crimes, but so had a lot of other people, and the only reason why they wound up in prison is because they couldn't pay a bribe to get out of the criminal justice process. So they were a very discontented group of prisoners. In the Czech Republic, we saw a different situation. Czech Republic actually has the lowest rates of unemployment in the EU, and unemployment is often mooted as one of the main drivers of recidivism. So that wasn't the situation in the Czech Republic. They all found jobs rather quickly. But when they went into prison, the Czech Republic also has high levels of consumer debt. So they would enter into the prison with debt. They were allowed, about half of them were allowed to work in prison, but they weren't paid very much. And over time, their debts increased to the point that when they were released from prison, they were no longer looking for legal jobs, or certainly not the kind of jobs that they could access with their skill levels. In Thailand, we found, again, a completely different situation. And really what's causing the problem here is it's an unintended consequence of the drug control system. Next slide, please. So just a few key facts about Thai prisons. In 2019, Thailand had 524 prisoners per 100,000 population, which is one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. and it's the highest female incarceration. That word is wrong. It shouldn't be rate, it should be share. So about 14% of the Thai prison population is female, and as far as I can tell, that's the highest rate I've found around the world in terms of the female prison share, at least in any large country. And the reason behind this is because of the drug. So many prisoners are in for drug offenses. Drugs are one of those offense areas where women have a higher participation rate relative to other crimes. So you'll find very few women around the world in prison for violent crimes, but you will find a relatively higher share for drug crimes. And for that reason, the higher the rate of drug crimes in your overall prison population, the higher the female participation. In 2015, every prison berth in Thai prisons was filled with over 2.5 inmates. That's the last official data we have. More recent data we got from the Department of Corrections suggests it's more like 3.3 inmates at this point, which is one of the highest rates of overcrowding in the world. 95% of the corrections budget is spent on food for the prisoners, salaries for the guards, and the construction of new prisons, with only 1% left over for rehabilitation programs. This is not unusual globally, but the reason why we bring up this point is if the prisons weren't so overcrowded, resources could be liberated for rehabilitation programs for the remaining inmates. About 80%, just under 80% of Thailand's prisoners are incarcerated for drug offenses. And as far as I can tell, again, that's the highest rate I've seen anywhere in the world. 78% of these drug detainees are in for yaba, which is this methamphetamine caffeine tablet that is popular in Thailand, and about 10% for ice, which is crystal methamphetamine. So almost all of the drug prisoners are in for some form of methamphetamine or another. And 76% of these detainees are in for possession with intent to sell. Now, this is a type of crime not just found in Thailand. It's in many parts of the world where when a person is arrested for drugs and they have in their possession beyond a certain threshold amount, they are assumed to be intending to sell those drugs, not simply possessing for personal use. And the problem is that this threshold that's been established in Thailand was established 18 years ago. And it was reduced 18 years ago to a very low level. And what the prisoners were telling us, and what we know from our own drug monitoring in Thailand and in the region, is the price of yaba has crashed. It's gone very, very low in recent years. It's so cheap now. They said, one of the inmates said it's cheaper than rice. And so this threshold may no longer really be that relevant to the current situation. Next slide, please. Okay, now you can see if you compare countries with very high incarceration rates, and there are some of the top countries right there, most of those countries also have higher crime rates. Here I'm using homicide as the proxy figure for overall crime, certainly violent crime, the most serious crimes. And Thailand's actually a very safe country overall, but it has this very high prison population. And this is the conundrum here. It doesn't need to have a high prison population based on at least its violent crime situation. It's really being driven by the drug prisoners. Next slide, please. And the funny thing is that as the homicide rate has dropped, as violent crime in the country has dropped, the incarceration rate has just shot up. And there's a very important historic event caught in this slide, which is the passage of the Rehabilitation of Narcotic Addicts Act in 2002. And that act allowed for diversion to treatment for people that are found in possession of less than 5 pills, which is a very small amount nowadays. But you can see how that caused an immediate decline in the prison population, and then it starts to climb back up again to higher than ever levels. And the reason for this is that a lot of these people are being apprehended with larger amounts of drugs than 5 pills, and that they are no longer eligible for diversion to treatment. They are now considered to be people in possession with intent to distribute. Next slide, please. This isn't unique to Thailand, however. If you divide the number of prisoners by the number of homicides over time, you can see all these countries have an increasing prison population despite declines in violent crime as proxied by the homicide rate. So, next slide, please. Thailand's just a particularly egregious example. And here again is that figure about the share of the prison population incarcerated for drugs, where Thailand's just head and shoulders over most other countries. About a fifth is typical of many of the countries which have serious drug enforcement efforts. And so Thailand is indeed remarkable in this respect. Next slide, please. Okay, now, if you look at between the three countries that we visited, you can see completely different compositions of the crime categories for which prisoners were sentenced. In Albania, fully a quarter of their prisoners are in for murder. So violent crime is a major constituent of that prison population. In Czech Republic, it's almost all property crime or administrative type crimes, various forms of fraud, a lot of financial sorts of crimes. And that dominates there. And of course, in Thailand, it's the drug situation. So this is a really interesting indicator of looking at these kind of prison offense compositions for why people are winding up back in prison again. Next slide, please. And of course, these differing offense profiles result in different sentencing lengths. So you can see in the Czech Republic, a good chunk of people are in for less than a year because the offenses for which they're in are relatively minor offenses. In contrast, in Albania, a very large chunk are in for more than 10 years. These are those murderers and other serious offenders. And in Thailand, you get most of the biggest chunk in the 1 to 5 year category. And on the upper end of that is what they're sentencing, it appears, people for this possession with intent to distribute. I think the judiciary is aware that these are not necessarily large-scale drug dealers, but at the same time, they have to sentence them within the range. Next slide, please. Okay, so now when we actually spoke to the prisoners in the focus groups about why they returned, they were very consistent in their responses. Chanta can back me up on this, that the first words out of their mouth oftentimes was the environment. Why did you come back to prison? It's the environment. And it's really about the fact that they had no place to go when they went out. Oftentimes, they're alienated from their families because of the stigma against drug use in Thailand. And so they went back to the only friends they knew, which were the people who were involved in drug networks and in drug selling. They insisted that their relationship with Yaba was not an addictive relationship. They could take it or leave it. It wasn't really about a chemical need for the drug or a psychological need for the drug. It was simply part of the social setting in which they found themselves. They did encounter difficulties in securing formal employment, particularly in factory settings or other places where people would do criminal record checks. But most of them were very clear that they could find informal employment, although it was oftentimes low paying if they chose to do so. And some of them were quite frank about the fact that the drug markets simply pay better than the informal employment for which they were eligible. And so when they were faced with that choice, they may have a difficult choice about whether or not they would choose to stay inside the law. And in particular, we got this line repeatedly that the people were in for dealing when in fact they were just a user, and they were buying more at once so as to avoid the risk associated with visiting their dealer so often. Next slide, please. So you can see this breakdown if you compare between countries. In Thailand, the single largest dominant answer was social networks, followed by unemployment. In the other countries, we get different types of responses. The big conditional release violations in the Czech Republic. More people talking about unemployment in Albania, but this is related to the answers they gave us about the environment. Next slide, please. And there was differences between gender based on this, however. Women were much more likely to say that unemployment or having friends, which may be also intimate partners involved in crime, were the main reasons for coming back to prison. Whereas men were more likely to list substance abuse or mental health issues and other types of issues. Next slide, please. So on the employment question, Czech Republic having the lowest rates of unemployment in the EU, you could see it was very easy for even released prisoners to find employment within a month, or at least become self-employed. In Thailand, it was more like 40% within 1 month, if you include self-employment. And within a year, also very high levels of overall people able to find employment, and about Albania, much less. So although finding employment is a challenge for people who are released from Thai prisons, it's not the central challenge. It's more about these social networks they find themselves in. Next slide, please. I think one really important question that we got to in our research is this idea, is whether or not prisoners who are sitting in prison think that it's fair that they're in prison. And you can see in Albania, the vast majority were very clear it was unfair. Not because they didn't commit the crime, but because they were being persecuted based on the fact that they weren't able to get themselves out of prison with a bribe. In Czech Republic, I think most of the people recognizing that they were they committed the crime for which they were imprisoned. They were serving their time. What was quite interesting, Thailand was a fairly large share of people who weren't certain, and this may be the group of people who admitted, yes, they were involved in drug markets and doing something illegal, but maybe they weren't in prison for the crime for which they were ultimately sentenced, which was drug dealing. In any case, from what we saw from the inmates we spoke to, there was a strong sense of personal responsibility in Thailand, which stood them apart from the other two countries we visited, where people were very clear they weren't blaming the system or the society as much as they were blaming themselves. And this was very refreshing to see. So our recommendations coming out of this is, on the one hand, that obviously people need some reintegration assistance. I think Sam was also alluding to this. This is a really critical thing, that they get beyond this initial readjustment period and don't have to fall back into the same old social networks on the one hand. And then also I think that the government of Thailand should probably reevaluate its thresholds in light of the new data that we have about the declining prices and probably purchasing patterns that are associated with those. There needs to be some fresh empirical evidence brought to the thresholds themselves. Can you put the last slide on, please, which should be the QR code for the publication that TIJ has very kindly published of our research. And I really encourage you all to take a look at that. It's a very interesting study, and the other companion studies will be coming out through UNODC shortly this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted, for the great presentation and summarizing the key findings from the research, and amazing initiative from UNODC to conduct a research about the main drive behind recidivism in the country worldwide. So we're really looking forward to the result of that global study. So I think Ted made a very good point about the, and his research also highlight the evidence of the drug policy, which is, not just applied to Thailand, but other countries who has the harsh drug policy and sentencing as well. So as we see, the prison populations go up while some of the violence crime is still going down. So that is something that the policymakers need to look at and use this data to form the criminal justice policy in the long future. So up next, we have presentations by Mr. Julio Cesar Cepeda. And to briefly introduce Mr. Julio, he is currently a retired senior officer with over 33 years of experience in the Argentina Federal Penitentiary Service with the title of Inspector General. He was the main coordinator of the unique dog training program in prison in Argentina. We are really delighted to have him here on the panel today because he was also the one of the original drafter of the Bangkok rules back in 2008, 2009. So today, Julio has kindly prepared and sent us the pre-recorded video where he presented in Spanish with English subtitle. And he will be also stay to answer any question that anyone might have. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor on to Julio and his presentation.
Muy buenas noches, mi nombre es Julio César Cepeda, soy un oficial superior retirado del Servicio Penitenciario Federal Argentino y que fui invitado a participar de este encuentro de una reunión auxiliar organizada por el Instituto de Justicia de Tailandia, el TIC, y el Instituto de las Naciones Unidas de Asia y Lejano Oriente, UNAFIM. Agradezco enormemente este honor de poder participar en esta reunión, tratando de comentarle la experiencia que hemos tenido en el Servicio Penitenciario Federal Argentino sobre la implementación de políticas relacionadas con las reglas de Bangkok y la generación de un programa de género en prisiones. Para iniciar, voy a comentarles que he participado por invitación del Reino de Tailandia allá en febrero de 2009 en la primer mesa redonda de expertos para poder realizar el primer borrador que a la postre, después de su revisión a fin de año, fue aprobado como las reglas de Bangkok. Eso para mí fue un honor y desde ese borrador poder transmitirlo a mi país para poder cambiar para bien una política de programas de tratamiento de mujeres en prisión. El objetivo de elaboración de este programa de género fue cumplir con los derechos de las personas privadas de libertad. Lo que buscamos fue abrir la cárcel hacia la sociedad y generar perspectivas y herramientas hacia el afuera, porque ya estaban adentro las mujeres en prisión, entonces lo que buscamos es mirar hacia afuera y buscarle esa reinserción y ese reintegro a la sociedad. Y reconocer que las personas privadas de libertad tienen responsabilidad y son portadoras de derechos. Y todo cambio no se puede hacer desde una oficina de gestión, una oficina de conducción, sino también debemos hacer una participación activa y capacitación de nuestro recurso humano sobre este proceso de cambio. El objetivo del programa, el objetivo general, fue proveer estándares adecuados respecto al tratamiento de las mujeres privadas de libertad que guarden estricto correlato con sus necesidades de género y faciliten en ese sentido un regreso al medio libre. Tenemos por lo menos 3 objetivos específicos que prevén la reinserción social a través de las mejores condiciones de vida de las mujeres en prisión y eliminación de la discriminación hacia ellas. Generar acciones que tiendan a lograr las relaciones y oportunidades igualitarias tanto en el hombre y en la mujer en la prisión y atender las actividades de género en las decisiones acerca de las actividades útiles para manejar su vida en libertad. Hemos tomado en este programa unos 10 o 11 ítems que iré explicando brevemente de cada uno por el tiempo que tenemos, pero uno de los primeros e importantes es el abordaje de tópicos del programa de género condicionantes al género en el programa de tratamiento. Un lugar adecuado tiene que ver con un alojamiento y un ordenamiento del sector a fin de evitar unidades con superpoblación penal que impiden una mejora en las condiciones de tratamiento. Por eso hemos seleccionado y adecuado sectores en otras unidades exclusivas de mujeres para bajar los números de unidades que tenían una población alta de arriba de 700 personas, mujeres, y una capacidad del 50%. Eso hacía imposible que esa unidad funcionara adecuadamente y que los programas de tratamiento se pudieran aplicar como estaban determinados. Una de las dificultades que habíamos observado es la aceptación por parte de la mujer su condición de mujer privada de libertad, pero era por un tema de falta de información. Entraba a la unidad y no tenía toda la información adecuada, entonces lo que se generó fue una información básica de las internas que se le entregaba al momento de ingresar y luego de hacerse una entrevista para que ella pudiera ir leyendo y adecuado. Y esa persona no tenía conocimiento del idioma español, fue traducido también al inglés. Se dieron folletos sobre el tema de traslado de unidades y cómo era el trámite para realizar la expulsión o el extrañamiento. También se le brindaba el reglamento interno de cada unidad donde estaba alojado. Para nosotros fue sumamente importante, y lo establece también las reglas de Bangkok, es el mantenimiento de los fuertes lazos familiares. Para aquellas personas donde su familia venía a visitarla, hemos hecho lugares para tener visitas privadas, para fortalecer la familia con su grupo familiar primario, y para aquellas mujeres que su familia estaba lejos o extranjeras, que estaban en otros países, tratamos de trabajar juntamente con los consulados para poder revincularlas a través de mensajerías instantáneas. Hemos también trabajado con unir los lazos familiares con la incorporación de sus hijos que estaban afuera con otras familias y en estas reuniones para revincular a la mamá con su familia. El tema salud en la población penal es muy fundamental, por eso el Ministerio de Justicia y Derechos Humanos de Argentina realizó convenios con el Ministerio de Salud de nuestro país para que todos los programas que estaban siendo dados a la población en libertad sean aplicados también a las personas privadas de libertad. Es por eso que hemos tenido el programa de salud social y procreación responsable, un programa de asistencia integral de salud para mujeres mayores de 50 años. Hemos tenido programas de tratamiento de VIH y drogadependiente, con tratamientos ambulatorios de drogadependiente, pero también con centros de rehabilitación de drogadependientes. Y así un montón de programas que tienen que ver con la salud y el control de la mujer mientras dura su detención o su internación en un establecimiento, pero poder continuar el momento libre con ese tratamiento en un centro asistencial de la ciudad, donde ella pueda vivir. El tema de educación y trabajo son fundamentales, por eso en el tema de educación se incorporó ya con un convenio marco que teníamos con la Universidad Nacional de Buenos Aires, un centro universitario para que las mujeres puedan participar en las carreras de elección que puedan obtener a partir de cumplir su educación primaria y secundaria. Se realizaron trabajos sobre la aplicación de un centro cultural, donde ellas podían tener una actividad de cine o cine debate o café cultura, como se llamaba el programa, y poder participar con actores de las películas que veían y poder discutir el contenido de esa actividad. El tema de trabajo se reforzó los centros de formación profesional que había en cada unidad y se solicitó a las autoridades educativas de buscar actividades de capacitación no estigmatizantes a la mujer. Entonces hemos logrado poder tener equipos de mujeres que trabajan en la construcción, chapa y pintura, armado de circuitos eléctricos, y eso hace de que no solamente se la capacite en lo que siempre caemos en capacitarla en hacer comida, coser y limpiar. Yo creo que la mujer tiene una amplia capacidad de otras actividades y otras profesiones. El tema es que tenemos que darle las herramientas adecuadas para que ellas las puedan aplicar. Uno de los temas que en la cárcel es cotidiano es el tema de la violencia y la conflictividad. Hemos trabajado máxima cuando hay una superpoblación, donde los conflictos son a diario, y empezamos con algo que nos dio excelentes resultados, que fue un comité de convivencia. Ese comité de convivencia estaba formado por funcionarios de la unidad, funcionarios de la administración central, yo he tomado parte en varias reuniones, y organizaciones gubernamentales o oficiales que de acuerdo al tema que tratábamos eran invitadas. Y participaban en representación de cada sector de alojamiento de la unidad, unas dos internas que traían su propuesta o sus problemas, y buscamos con forma conjunta de escucharnos y debatir soluciones. Temas como de salud, atención médica, atención primaria a los niños, pediatría, obstetricia, distintas especialidades, el tema de turnos en atención extramuro, y todos los problemas se buscaba una solución. Nos dio muy buen resultado, fue un diálogo abierto y permanente, y de esa forma se evitaron muchos conflictos dentro de las unidades. Se implementó también la mediación penitenciaria para el manejo de conflictos, que capacitamos a hombres y mujeres de nuestra institución para trabajar sobre esa herramienta para solucionar inconvenientes. Aquellas internas que entraban aquellas personas que entraban por primera vez a la prisión, teníamos un programa de internas primarias que duraba desde su ingreso como procesada hasta su posibilidad de ser condenada, pero siempre sobre la línea de ser primaria y no tratar como una persona reincidente. El tema de la protección de grupos vulnerables, uno de ellos son las personas extranjeras que usan su idioma nacional el inglés o su segunda lengua es la inglesa, entonces no tiene conocimiento del idioma castellano. Se hizo un programa de internas angloparlantes y se trabajó fuertemente con la vinculación del consulado en su llegada y sus necesidades y su vinculación con su familia en el país de origen en caso que ella lo quisiera. También se trabajó con el consulado y la Dirección Nacional de Migraciones respecto a la preparación para el entrañamiento, es decir, al momento de cumplirse la mitad de la condena pueda regresar a su país. Y la protección de los derechos humanos tuvo que ver con una formación fuerte por medio de otros institutos y no por instituto propio de capacitación para trabajar sobre la mediación, la violencia de género y la prevención de incidentes. Eso dio de que el personal esté muy cerca de la conducción y muy cerca de las mujeres privadas de libertad para mejorar su calidad de vida intramuros. Actualmente, hace poco, se implementó un programa que para mí revincula a la mujer privada de libertad con el medio social, que es un programa de adiestramiento de perros de asistencia que permite a ellas capacitarla en el arte del adiestramiento de animales para ser utilizado por personas con discapacidad y en el tiempo, desde 2013 a la fecha, dieron excelentes resultados. Hemos trabajado con internas extranjeras que se incorporaron voluntarias o nacionales y ellas han entregado perros a personas con discapacidad que han venido a la unidad a trabajar a una etapa primaria, que es la etapa de acoplamiento entre el usuario y la persona privada de libertad. Ese programa dio muy buenos beneficios y fue muy buenos resultados y fue distinguido por el Senado de la Nación por la calidad de trabajo que está haciendo desde la cárcel con mira a un grupo vulnerable social como son las personas con discapacidad. Esto sigue dando resultados y se está ampliando a otras unidades. Para finalizar, quiero comentarles de que el Servicio Penitenciario Federal y el Ministerio de Justicia y Derechos Humanos, en el momento que se aprobaron las reglas de Bangkok, realizó un encuentro iberoamericano de género en prisiones, que participaron dos organizaciones muy importantes como el Consejo de Ministros de Justicia de Iberoamérica y el Instituto Latinoamericano de las Naciones Unidas para la Prevención del Delito y el Tratamiento Delincuente, y la ANUD, y vinieron representantes de Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, España, El Salvador, Guatemala, México, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Portugal, República Dominicana, Uruguay y nuestro representante. Luego de un trabajo de 2 jornadas sobre el tema de, como objetivo principal eran las reglas de Bangkok y el tema del género en contexto de encierro, hemos logrado entrar en un acuerdo de generar un programa regional para que cada país desarrolle conforme a su legislación y a su realidad interna, que se tomó como base el programa de género de prisiones del Servicio Penitenciario Federal Argentino como un documento marco y de buenas prácticas de la región. Desde ya agradezco y espero que se haya podido comprender este breve resumen de nuestra experiencia y agradezco profundamente a las autoridades de TIC, del Instituto de Justicia de Tailandia, y a todas sus autoridades que me convocaron para este evento. Desde ya muchísimas gracias y estoy a su entera disposición. Buenas noches.
Thank you very much, Julio, for a great presentation, which highlight national effort in Argentina and a lot of innovative ideas in trying to achieve the gender-sensitive treatments within prison and efforts to improve their reintegration prospect. So from practices in Argentina, I would like to move on to experience and practices in Japan. Our next speaker, I would like to introduce Mr. Takeshi Morikawa, professor at UNIFE in Japan. Mr. Morikawa has been a professor of the UNIFE since April 2019. Before working at UNIFE, he served as officer at the Rehabilitation Bureau, the Ministry of Justice of Japan, and was in charge of policy making and promoting activities related to community corrections, especially the activities of volunteer probation officer. And today he will share with us about the experience from Japan. Mr. Morikawa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chondit-san. Good morning or some good evening. Welcome to Kyoto virtually. I'm Morikawa Takeshi, a professor of UNIFE, Assistant Institute of TIJ. It's a great honor to have this opportunity. I'd like to share the Japanese experience of rehabilitation and social integration of women prisoners, especially in the area of community corrections. This is outline of this presentation. First, I'd like to introduce characteristics of women prisoners in Japan. Then I briefly introduce community-based treatment in Japan. Finally, I'd like to share some good practices in Japanese halfway houses. There are characteristics of women prisoners in Japan. Like the white paper on crime, the number of the women prisoners is increasing. Especially for women prisoners, there are some who have suffered traumatic experiences or eating disorders. To address these issues, the 2012 General Plan for Preventing Reoffending by the Japanese government emphasizes the importance of providing guidance and support for women prisoners. I will show you details of these characteristics from the next slide. The white paper on crime contains the details of the characteristics of women prisoners. One is that the rates of offenders who committed theft and drug offenses are high compared to male offenders. The rate of those two offenses by women prisoners is 85%. That is more than 20 points higher than that of male prisoners. Also, the percentage, this is offenses by prisoners comparing men and women. Also, the percentage of elderly women over 65 years old has increased sharply. The ratio was 3.7% in 1998, but it rose to 19.7% in 2017. As for crimes committed by elderly women prisoners, theft is the predominant offense at the rate of 86.1%. Furthermore, about 80% of those are shoplifting. Those are characteristics of women prisoners in Japan. Before moving to this slide, I will briefly comment community-based treatment in Japan. To prevent the recommission of crime by women prisoners, community-based treatment is important in addition to treatment in prison. In Japan, In Japan, community-based treatment, which takes the individual characteristics of women offender into consideration, is administered by both governmental and non-governmental bodies. This includes community supervision by Japan's corps of nearly 48,000 volunteer probation officers, Hogoshi, who serves as part-time public officers without compensation. First of all, Japanese probation officers often report that women offenders share similar characteristics: low self-esteem, lack of trust in others, hesitancy to reveal their true intentions, anxiety, and loneliness. Considering those characteristics, treatment for women offenders starts with assessing the background of the offense and each offender's personal character. This assessment is important for planning effective and practical treatment to prevent reoffending. Matching the offender with the appropriate volunteer probation officer is also important, because the volunteer probation officers take important roles like making contact with local government services. Also, guiding offenders to attend appropriate treatment programs to address specific criminal tendencies is important. Finally, I'd like to introduce practices in the halfway house to address offenses with specific criminal tendencies. Before introducing these programs, I'll give an overview of a halfway house, Ryozenkai, in Tokyo, in Japan, which has over 100 years of history. Generally, halfway houses in Japan are publicly subsidized facilities for released offenders with appropriate place to reside. Ryozenkai is one of the 103 halfway houses in Japan operated by the private sector. Ryozenkai is also one of the 7 halfway houses in Japan that accepts only women. The total capacity is 20 persons, including juveniles. The average age of residents is around 45 years old. Generally, the main role of halfway houses is providing accommodation for offenders and serving meals until they save enough money to live independently. However, many halfway houses like Ryozenkai offer offender treatment and rehabilitation programs to residents to prevent reoffending. I'd like to introduce 2 programs among them. The first is the Rose Cafe Project. The Rose Cafe Project is a drug dependence treatment guidance program from 2012. The program was introduced to address the increasing number of female drug offenders, recognizing the necessity of ensuring that such offenders receive proper treatment. The treatment program involves cognitive behavioral therapy for drug offenders, and it is administered in group settings by specific who work with Ryozenkai. Offenders can enroll in program for up to 3 years after leaving Ryozenkai, while working and living independently. Another practice is the Reconnect project. The Reconnect project began in 2013 and consists of mental care-based treatment guidance for habitual thieves. However, this program is required for every offender accommodated in Ryozenkai. This program consists of 52 sections operated by trained VPOs, volunteer probation officers, with weekly interviews. The purpose of the program is to prevent offending by enabling the offenders to reconnect their thoughts, processes, and learn how to control their behavior when facing difficulties in their daily lives. Through this program, the offenders can make sustainable and continuous connections with VPOs. It prevents offenders from becoming isolated in society and also from reoffending. That's all my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and please enjoy the whole contents of Kyoto Congress. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morikawa, for sharing with us some interesting and promising initiative in Japan. Both the Rose Cafe and Reconnect projects are very promising, and it's unfortunate that we are not there to actually visit the facilities, but I'm sure it would be really interesting. And for our next speaker, we have Ms. Sira Chanturia, Regional Director for South Caucasus Penal Reform International, which she will be present through a pre-recorded video. So before we move on to her video, I would like to briefly introduce her. Mr. Chanturia has been working for the Penal Reform International South Caucasus Regional Office for almost 18 years and has held the positions of a regional directors for this office for the past 11 years. She has designed and implemented a number of projects in the areas of gender-sensitive justice and rehabilitations and re-socialization services for women in prison and on probation, as well as promoting international standards for human rights in the field of criminal justice. And today she will be sharing her work at the Penal Reform International in South Caucasus.
Greetings, dear ladies and gentlemen. Honored to be part of this ancillary meeting on the rehabilitation and reintegration of women prisoners, albeit in a distant and virtual mode. My name is Sira Chanturia, and I'm a Regional Director for Penal Reform International in the South Caucasus region, located at the crossroads of Asia and Europe, between the Black and Caspian Seas. I have been asked by the organizers of this meeting to talk about the existing situation, examples, good practices and challenges of rehabilitating and reintegrating women in Georgia. In fact, PRI has done a lot of work in this country since 2009 to raise awareness about women's gender-specific needs and challenges that they face in the criminal justice sector, especially in prisons, and has developed a number of programs of rehabilitation for women in prison and also post-release support schemes for ex-prisoners and women on probation in partnership with local civil society organizations. We have also undertaken a number of activities to promote the UN Bangkok rules by talking to policy makers at various events and by training prison staff who work directly with women prisoners about women prisoners' gender-specific needs and challenges and advantages of taking gender-sensitive approaches and policies in the criminal justice system. I'll start by saying that the global pandemic of COVID-19 has negatively affected the situation with regard to the provision of rehabilitation programs and services, just like almost everywhere, also in Georgia's penitentiaries, including the only women's prison, as strict measures have been put in place for the prevention of the coronavirus, of the spread of the coronavirus. There have been restrictions placed on family visits to prisons with glass barriers installed between prisoners and visitors, despite the fact that family visits are such important means for women in prison to keep in touch with their families and, most importantly, with their children. There has been a ban on the delivery of programs of rehabilitation, especially by NGOs and any external institutions, any other external institutions. Also access to support staff such as social workers and psychologists, and for their counseling and assistance has been rather limited. Needless to say that this situation has greatly exacerbated the already existing gaps and shortcomings in the provision for women in prison. Gender-specific needs of women in criminal justice systems in different countries are not dissimilar, as suggested by research findings. Some of the outstanding needs of women concern their victimization, so having been victims of abuse and violence, and the need for psychosocial rehabilitation. Also gender-specific healthcare and aspects related to women's caretaking responsibilities for their children. Hence, their ties with children at home or elsewhere, such as foster care or state custody, need to be strengthened and maintained. We were able to develop projects addressing women's needs and priorities and challenges based on findings from a couple of pieces of research that were undertaken earlier in 2011 and also in 2013, in line with the recommendations of the UN Bangkok Rules, in particular Rules 67 and 69. These research exercises provided valuable insight for us into the background, characteristics, and social reintegration needs of female offenders, which we used as advocacy tool. And such preliminary insight helps to better understand women's issues and to develop needs-based programs for them. Also, these are good tools for advocating with national governments so that their approaches become more gender sensitive. Prison staff training helps a lot to sensitize them to women's offenders' needs and challenges. Responding to women's needs, our projects delivered through NGO partners have provided essential multi-care rehabilitative services to women prisoners, former prisoners, and those serving probation. The services provided have included legal aid, psychological and social counseling, financial support for medical care, vocational skills training and work opportunities, accommodation for homeless, former prisoners in a temporary shelter, and support in maintaining regular contact with their children or in resuming broken ties with their families, as social support networks are very important for the rehabilitation. These services have, for the most part, been very well received by service users, and there have been high levels of satisfaction reported. The legal aid has provided women with solutions to their often long-standing legal problems related to children's custody, divorce, and property rights, allowing them to take steps towards their reintegration and moving on with their lives. This was because the project had been able to set aside funds to pay court fees or for identity documents of women prisoners. The psychological counseling provided by the projects was also very welcome, especially by those women still in prison. There was considerably higher degree of trust towards NGO psychologists compared to prison psychologists, as having more considerate, flexible approaches. Women beneficiaries said psychological counseling provided them with space for emotional release and expression, as well as hope and a feeling that they are not alone. It also helps them become more self-assured and assertive. Training skill courses, job counseling, and paid work opportunities for women in and outside prison were provided by our NGO partners, and these have included culinary skills, hairdressing, beauty therapy, traditional felt making, and sewing, including opportunities to work and earn money in the sewing workshop, fulfilling contracts. Many women were optimistic that the skills they learned would help them find work after prison. However, the main benefit of these activities has been the boost to women's self-esteem and confidence, the structure they brought to women's lives, and opportunities for socializing. The priority for most women was finding long-term employment, but they recognize also the stigma and discrimination they face in Georgian society because of their involvement in the criminal justice system. Providing seed money for small startup businesses to ex-prisoner women has also turned out to be instrumental in supporting their resocialization and leading and helping them to lead law-abiding and financially more fulfilled lives after release. One of the key components of our latest project has also been a childcare support, the need identifying during beneficiary needs assessment. We have set up a nursery at the women's prison with a childminder educator for young children living there with their prisoner mothers to help them attain their development milestones. Our projects have also demonstrated that a holistic approach to addressing women's issues works the best, starting working with them whilst they are in prison and providing a wide range of support services such as legal, psychosocial, vocational training, childcare support, medical, etc., and continuing as post-release support scheme. Women's economic empowerment is also an essential thing, and providing post-release employment or self-employment support is needed in order to help them acquire self-sufficient and law-abiding lives in order to prevent reoffending. Civil society organizations, NGOs, are well placed to provide these support schemes as they have well-trained and considerate staff. However, the state agencies should undertake to provide relevant funding and other support for this to be a fruitful cooperation in a multi-stakeholder mode. In the end, I just would like to emphasize that even during the pandemic, it is essential that at least some rehabilitation support is available and accessible for women prisoners, for instance, some distant or online counseling services. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for her great presentations about the efforts of civil society in collaborations with prison authorities in South Caucasus. I think the last presenter has significantly point out a great initiative that has been implemented in that country. So I think that would give us some ideas of how to implement this gender-sensitive and responsive for women's reintegrations and rehabilitation programs. So we have about 15 minutes for the Q&A. So I would like to ask the panelists. So these are the questions that are posed by the audience. So the first questions, and I think this one is for Ted. So how is recidivism calculated in your criminal justice system, and are there any good practices available when calculating recidivism rate?
Thank you. I think Thailand actually has an excellent method for calculating the recidivism rate, which is they track the individual prisoners through their national identification numbers, and what this produces a recidivism rate which is time-bound. So you can tell it's very consistent across years. In Thailand, usually about, I think it's a sixth or something of the prisoners that are released in any given year will return about a year later, and progresses to about a third after 3 years. So this is one way of generating a recidivism rate. For the purposes of our work, though, we focus in order to get a figure for countries which don't have such good tracking of individual prisoners. We've looked at the share of prisoners that are in prison that were in prison previously. This is not truly a recidivism rate because it doesn't capture reoffending, it captures reincarceration. But I think from a corrections perspective, it's the most useful metric because these are essentially return customers that you don't want to have coming back and placing a greater burden on the corrections system. So for cross-national comparisons, we've used that figure, although countries like Thailand have more advanced systems which allow more accurate descriptions of the actual rate of people coming back into prison. It's a very complicated topic, we know, to actually get at whether or not someone's desist from crime or not is not actually possible until that person's dead. So there's always a compromise between indicators. And since we're focusing on the correction system, we looked at that particular way of calculating the rate. Thanks.
Thank you. Any speaker would like to add to that? Okay. If not, we have 2 more questions. Any speaker who would like to answer that question, just please, feel free to raise your hand, and then we can just turn on your speaker. So the next question is that peer groups seem to play a key role in the reoffending of women. How can this issue be tackled? And I'll read out the last question as well, in case anybody would like to answer that. So the other question is to do with so since going back to the own environment is the major cause of recidivism for inmates in Thailand, the availabilities of halfway house seems to be solutions. But one of the prominent private halfway house in Thailand also struggle is to attract and retain former inmates to stay for the long run. So in the panelist view, what might be the cause and how can we solve these problems? And I think even though this question was asked in the context of Thailand, I think it could, other speaker who has experience about halfway house and can answer too. So Sam, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm just going to address the first question around peer groups. I think one of the key things that we found in our research with Chontit was that family became really important to sort of break that connection between those deviant peer groups and reoffending. So a lot of the women we spoke to talked about the importance of their family, the importance of reconnecting with their family and their family's love and support as the way to keep away from their deviant friends or more often than not, deviant intimate partners. So there's sort of this reprioritisation of family that came across quite strongly in the interviews that we did with the woman. So I talk about, I will go home to my family, my mum is really supportive, my grandmother is really supportive. If I have their support and love, I won't feel the need to return and start hanging out with those, my deviant friends, or I'll keep away from my problematic husband or boyfriend.
Thank you. Ted?
I was just going to say, not only in Thailand, but in the other countries we looked at, the extreme importance of these first few months out of prison, that reintegration programs are so vital during that period of time. We mustn't ever think that the job of corrections is finished when the inmates leave, that they need intensive support. And I was really intrigued by hearing the Japanese model of providing halfway house assistance so that people can develop sufficient funds to be able to support themselves without having to fall back on their old ways. So this idea of subsidized housing that allows for people to earn a stake, I think would also be very applicable in a place like Czech Republic, where simply those first 3 or 4 months is where people are most vulnerable.
Anyone else? Mr. Morikawa, would you like to add something around the use of halfway house in Japan and the experience?
Thank you very much. So just a few words about the halfway houses in Japan. So in halfway houses, as I said, not just only provide the accommodations for women offenders, they also provide some programs and make women offenders to live by themselves, like providing for some programs for specific needs and specific challenges, like control their themselves, and also they provide some educational and some programs for living. So it's just my adding few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sam, would you like to add something? You're still raising the hand.
Yes, I'm still raising my hand. So I just wanted to sort of say halfway houses are an excellent idea as well, because especially so again, referring to the research that we did in Thailand, because some of the women who lived in particular communities, which they described as red zones, which tended to have high amounts of drug offending taking place. They didn't have good familial ties. They didn't want to go back to those red zones because those red zones were not only was there a lot of drug offending going on there, but there was a high police presence in those red zones. So there was an over-policing that was taking place in those red zones. So they were particularly nervous and often said it would be good if we had somewhere to go, some sort of temporary accommodation so that we can get on our feet and then earn enough money to therefore not have to go back and live in those red zones. So, and I know there are a few halfway houses operating in Thailand, but I think, yes, halfway houses play a huge role in preventing reoffending and also helping women to successfully reintegrate back into the community, because they also provide a safe space for these women to be as well.
Thank you. And I myself, I could add to that question regarding the halfway house. Oftentimes when women are located to the halfway house, they want to be away from the environment that they were before coming to prison. But oftentimes the halfway house is not, cannot just be just the housing. It has to have a program which are responsible, that are responsive to their needs. To ensure that their mental health, strength, and also other support. And sometimes the location of halfway house is also an issue, because women still want to, keep on contact to their children, but oftentimes the distance could be a big challenge. So I do not see any other questions in the system. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left before the session ends. Is there any panelists would like to make give a final words before we end this? And to keep looking forward, I mean, in this 5 minutes time, if one recommendation that you would like, yes, go ahead, Morikawa.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Julio. So you mentioned about vocational training in prisons. What kind of training popular among women offenders? Can translate into Spanish?
Julio, this question is for you.
Sorry, no hablo mucho inglés. Estoy intentando de saber cuál es la pregunta que me hizo el amigo de Kyoto. And the question. No entendí la pregunta.
มีแปลเลย Sorry, I have some technical problem, and I just now I'm back in the room. So, Julio, the questions is regarding about vocational training that are popular in Argentina. Feel free to type in your answer in the chat box, and our colleagues will be able to translate that into English.
Okay. Maybe we can translate in Spanish, so.
And I think from Julio's presentation, there are a lot of interesting initiatives, which there are several vocational training as well as rehabilitation program. I am fascinated by the dog training program that Julio presented, and I have learned about this program in the past several years, through Julio personal Facebook page, and I think this has been implemented in many countries. Using animals is one way to increase inmates' self-confidence and disciplines. I think that has been used in a number of countries. So I think Julio is answering your questions, Mr. Morikawa, in the chat box. So please refer to that.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. So if there is no further questions, any panelists would like to ask each other any other questions?
I just wanted to say about the vocational training in Argentina. I know in other South American countries, after listening to the South Caucasus training programs, which it sounded to me like they were the more traditional feminine vocational roles. In Latin America, I know also in Bolivia, they've trained women to be construction workers, which is where the jobs are, the high-paying jobs are. And by breaking through the sort of gender stereotypes about the types of training that are appropriate for women, I think they've opened up real job opportunities for women in a new way.
Yeah, I think that has been some movement in Thailand as well, if I may add that, to improve the type of vocational training implemented in prison. The world is moving forward and we are moving into a digital world. The world about digital employabilities, we try to promote that, the use of the call center business where women can participate and get a really high pay. So a lot of countries try to, gear their design and implementations of the vocational training towards that direction that we responsive to the needs in the labor market. Okay. So I think today we have a great 5 panelists who share their amazing experience in terms of research and practices in the different parts of the world. So I would like to thank all the speakers and would like to summarize that from the research and practices around the world, we have seen that women's experience imprisonment and their transition back to societies different from their male counterparts. So it is important for us to, put on the gender lens when we design the policies and program for women's prisoner and women's offender. And I think having simply gender neutral policy might not be the best answer for these situations. And as mentioned by several speakers, the collaborations between prisons and communities, private sector, civil society is also an important elements to ensure the successful reintegrations of women's prisoners. So with that, I would like to thank all the panelists for their times and efforts in preparing this amazing presentation today. I know for a lot of you, the time zone is really difficult, and thank you, particularly Ted, for staying up so late. I know it's like 2-3 a.m. in your time, and also Julio for staying up and staying with us at this hour as well. I would also like to particularly thank our partner UNIFAE for a great preparations and provide the support throughout the preparations and for this session. Thank you so much, Morikawa and the technical team in Kyoto. And with that, I would like to end the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.